Bullies ripped her new top. Her flying elbow took him down fast. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Jefferson High School's parking lot as Kira Voss carefully maneuvered her aging Honda Civic into a space near the back row. At 17, she had developed a routine that kept her largely invisible to the social predators that prowled the hallways of her high school. Park, far from the main entrance, arrive exactly 7 minutes before first bell. Take the side stairwell to avoid the crowded main corridor, and always, always keep her head down. Kira adjusted her backpack straps as she walked through the crowded hallways, her dark brown eyes scanning for the quickest route to her next class while simultaneously cataloguing potential threats. Her petite frame, standing barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, made her appear fragile to those who didn't know better. She had learned to use this to her advantage, moving through crowds like a ghost, noticed but not remembered. Her straight black hair fell in a curtain around her face, often serving as a shield from unwanted attention. And she had perfected the art of looking busy, even when she had nowhere urgent to be. Born to Korean immigrant parents who had arrived in America when Kira was just 3 years old, she had learned early that keeping a low profile was often the safest strategy in a school where standing out could make you a target. Her parents, Dr. Kira's father Jin-woo Voss and her mother Soo Jin, had worked tirelessly to build a life in their adopted country. Jin-woo had been forced to repeat his medical residency despite being a practicing physician in Seoul for 8 years, while Soo Jin cleaned office buildings at night to make ends meet during those difficult early years. The family had eventually found stability when Jin-woo established his family practice in the predominantly white suburb where Jefferson High was located, and Soo Jin opened a small but successful Korean restaurant called Seoul Kitchen downtown. They had chosen this particular neighborhood specifically for its schools, believing that education was the key to their daughter's future success in America. What they hadn't anticipated was how their daughter's obvious foreign heritage would make her a target in a school where diversity was more of a buzzword than a reality. What her classmates didn't know was that Kira had been training in Taekwondo since she was 8 years old. Her father, a former national competitor in South Korea who had earned his 4th degree black belt before immigrating, had insisted she learn to defend herself. He had witnessed too many instances of his quiet, studious daughter being overlooked or dismissed, and he wanted her to have the confidence that came with knowing she could protect herself if necessary. But Jin-woo had also taught her something equally important. Discipline meant knowing when not to fight. True strength, he would tell her during their training sessions in the converted garage behind their house, is having the power to destroy your enemies, but choosing a better path. Any fool can throw a punch, Kira. It takes wisdom to know when restraint is the greater victory. These words echoed in her mind every day as she navigated the complex social minefield of high school, where reputation could be destroyed with a single poorly timed response to provocation. Kira's training had been rigorous and comprehensive. 3 evenings a week, she and her father would work through forms, sparring drills, and conditioning exercises. Jin-woo had supplemented her Taekwondo training with elements of Hapkido and basic judo throws, believing that a complete martial artist should be prepared for any situation. By age 15, Kira had earned her 2nd degree black belt and could break boards with kicks that generated enough force to stop a grown man. Her flexibility was remarkable, her speed was lightning quick, and her technique was textbook perfect. Yet for the past 2 years at Jefferson High, she had never once used her skills in anger. When Tommy Rodriguez had shoved her in the lunch line during her sophomore year, she had simply apologized and moved to the back. When Ashley Morrison had accidentally knocked her science project off the table, destroying weeks of work, Kira had cleaned up the mess without complaint and asked for an extension to rebuild it. When Marcus Webb had cornered her after school and made inappropriate comments about exotic Asian girls, she had walked away even though she could have easily broken his wrist in 3 different ways. Each incident had been reported by her father during their evening training sessions, and each time Jin Woo had listened carefully before offering the same advice. You have the power to stop these things, but power without wisdom is just violence. Show them who you are through your actions, not your reactions. Kira had internalized this philosophy so completely that she had begun to wonder if her father was wrong, if perhaps her restraint was being interpreted as weakness rather than strength. The trouble had started 3 weeks ago when Kira accidentally bumped into Blake Morrison in the cafeteria. Blake, the self-appointed king of Jefferson High's social hierarchy, stood 6 feet tall with the kind of quarterback build that made teachers look the other way when he got too loud in class. His sandy blonde hair was always perfectly styled with expensive products, and his clothes, designer jeans, name-brand hoodies, and limited edition sneakers, announced his family's wealth to anyone who cared to notice. Blake's father owned the largest car dealership in the county, and his mother sat on the school board, facts that Blake never let anyone forget. What made Blake particularly dangerous wasn't just his physical presence or his family connections, but his ability to rally others to his cause. He possessed a certain charisma that allowed him to convince his followers that cruelty was entertainment, that targeting the weak was not just acceptable, but somehow necessary for maintaining the natural order of high school society. Blake had perfected the art of plausible deniability, always managing to make his harassment look accidental or justified. The incident in the cafeteria had been genuinely accidental on Kira's part. She had been carrying her lunch tray, looking for an empty table, when another student had bumped into her from behind. The domino effect had sent her stumbling directly into Blake, who had been standing near the condiment station with his usual entourage. Her chocolate milk had splashed onto his expensive white polo shirt, leaving a dark stain across the designer logo. "Watch where you're going, foreign girl," Blake had sneered that first day, loud enough for half the cafeteria to hear. The way he emphasized the word foreign made it clear that this wasn't about the spilled milk at all. Kira had immediately begun apologizing, offering to pay for dry cleaning, even reaching for napkins to help clean up the mess. But something in her quiet dignity had clearly irritated him. Perhaps it was the way she didn't cower or beg for forgiveness. Perhaps it was how she met his eyes for just a moment before turning away, showing respect without fear. Whatever it was, Blake had decided that day that she needed to be put in her place. "Don't worry about it," Blake had said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Accidents happen, just be more careful next time." But Kira had caught the undertone in his voice, the promise that this wasn't over. She had cleaned up the spill, apologized once more, and found a table in the far corner of the cafeteria. She hadn't realized that Blake's apparent forgiveness was actually the beginning of a campaign designed to slowly but systematically destroy her sense of safety at school. Blake's main accomplice was Tyler Hendricks, a lanky redhead with pale skin that showed every emotion through fluctuating shades of pink and red. Tyler stood nearly as tall as Blake, but lacked the muscle mass, giving him an awkward, stretched appearance that made him look like a scarecrow dressed in expensive clothes. His cruel smile seemed to be his only genuine expression, and he had developed an unsettling habit of laughing at inappropriate moments. Tyler was the kind of person who would record fights on his phone and post them online, cackling as he watched the view count climb and reading the comments aloud to anyone who would listen. Tyler's role in Blake's inner circle was that of the court jester and documentarian. He provided comic relief during their harassment campaigns and ensured that their victims' humiliation was preserved for posterity. His phone was constantly recording, capturing moments of cruelty that he would edit into highlight reels and share on social media. Tyler lived for the validation that came from viral content, and he had discovered that videos of social outcasts being humiliated generated more engagement than anything else he posted. The third member of their group was Jessica Palmer, a girl whose beauty was matched only by her vicious tongue. Jessica stood 5'7" with the kind of blonde hair and blue eyes that appeared frequently in teen magazines. Her wardrobe was carefully curated to project an image of effortless perfection, and she moved through the hallways with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her place at the top of the social hierarchy. Jessica had perfected the art of social destruction, able to ruin reputations with a few well-placed words whispered in the right ears at exactly the right moment. Jessica's cruelty was more sophisticated than Blake's physical intimidation or Tyler's crude humor. She specialized in psychological warfare, identifying her victims' insecurities and exploiting them with surgical precision. She could make someone feel worthless without ever raising her voice or using obvious insults. Her weapon of choice was the backhanded compliment, the concerned observation, the helpful suggestion that planted seeds of self-doubt that would grow and fester long after the conversation ended. Together, the three formed a perfect storm of adolescent malice. Blake provided the physical presence and leadership. Tyler documented their activities and amplified their reach through social media, and Jessica handled the more subtle forms of psychological torture. They had reduced several students to tears over the years, and at least 2 had transferred to other schools after becoming targets of their coordinated harassment. The bullying had started small, as it always did with Blake's campaigns. A shoulder check in the hallway here, delivered with just enough force to send Kira stumbling, but not enough to be considered assault. A snide comment there, made just loud enough for Kira to hear, but quietly enough that teachers couldn't be certain what had been said. Blake was a master of escalation, understanding that the key to effective harassment was the gradual increase in intensity that prevented victims from identifying a single incident dramatic enough to report. During the first week, the harassment was so subtle that Kira almost convinced herself she was imagining it. Blake would appear in her path just often enough to force her to change direction, but always with plausible reasons for being there. Jessica would make comments about some people who clearly didn't understand American fashion or social customs, never mentioning Kira by name, but making it obvious who the target was. Tyler would accidentally bump into her while filming TikTok videos, always apologizing profusely while ensuring that the camera captured her annoyed expression. But the campaign escalated quickly, as Blake's campaigns always did. They began knocking books from her hands, always while she was navigating crowded areas where her scattered papers would be trampled by passing students. They would trip her on the stairs, catching her just enough to prevent serious injury, but ensuring that she would stumble embarrassingly. They whispered cruel jokes about her appearance just loud enough for her to hear, comments about her eyes being too small, her skin being too yellow, her clothes being too foreign. The psychological component of their harassment was perhaps even more damaging than the physical aspects. Blake would position himself and his friends near Kira's locker between classes, forcing her to walk past their loud conversations about people who don't belong here and immigrants who don't know their place. Jessica would start rumors about Kira's family, suggesting that her father wasn't really a doctor, but worked as a janitor at the medical clinic, or that her mother's restaurant served food that had made several people sick. Tyler's contribution was to ensure that Kira's humiliation followed her beyond school hours. He would tag her in social media posts featuring funny pictures he had taken of her stumbling or looking embarrassed, always with captions that stopped just short of explicit harassment but made his meaning clear. His followers would add their own comments, creating a digital pile-on that continued long after Kira had left school grounds. The teachers at Jefferson High seemed to operate under the philosophy that if they didn't see it directly, it wasn't their problem. This willful blindness was partly due to the school's culture of avoiding conflict and partly due to the influence that Blake's family wielded in the district. The Morrison family had donated significant money for new athletic facilities, and Blake's mother's position on the school board made most teachers reluctant to create problems that might affect their job security. Mrs. Rodriguez, Kira's English teacher, had once witnessed Blake accidentally spill water on Kira's homework during a group project session. The assignment was a carefully researched essay on Korean-American literature that Kira had spent 2 weeks perfecting. Blake had been gesturing wildly while telling a story, and his water bottle had somehow found its way into his hand just as his arm swept across Kira's desk. The pages had been soaked instantly, the ink running together to create an illegible mess. Mrs. Rodriguez had sighed and told Kira she could turn the assignment in the next day. But she hadn't asked Blake to help clean up the mess, or even acknowledge that his accident seemed remarkably well-timed. Kira had spent that evening recreating her essay from memory and backup notes, working until 2 in the morning to meet the deadline. Blake had received full credit for his own hastily written paper about a book he clearly hadn't read. Mr. Thompson, the physics teacher, had been present when Jessica made loud comments about people who eat weird food during lunch period, glancing meaningfully at Kira's traditional Korean meal while holding her nose in exaggerated disgust. Several students had laughed, and Kira had quietly wrapped up her food and left the classroom where she had been eating to avoid the cafeteria crowds. Mr. Thompson had continued grading papers as if nothing had happened. Even Principal Martinez, who prided himself on maintaining discipline at Jefferson High, seemed to develop selective blindness when it came to Blake's behavior. When Kira's mother had called to express concern about her daughter's obvious distress and declining grades, Martinez had assured her that there were no documented incidents of harassment and suggested that Kira might benefit from counseling to help her adjust to American social dynamics. The administration's indifference wasn't entirely due to willful ignorance. Jefferson High had a reputation to maintain as one of the top-performing schools in the district, and acknowledging a systemic bullying problem would require resources and attention that might detract from their focus on test scores and college placement statistics. It was easier to treat each incident as isolated and minor, rather than recognizing the coordinated campaign that was systematically destroying a student's well-being. Kira endured it all with the same quiet dignity that had first attracted Blake's attention. She would clean up the mess, gather her scattered papers, and continue with her day. Her classmates, grateful not to be targets themselves, would look away or pretend they hadn't seen anything. In the complex ecosystem of high school social dynamics, Kira had become the designated victim, the one whose suffering allowed others to feel safe. The few students who might have been inclined to help were effectively neutralized by the social dynamics that Blake and his crew had established. David Chen, a quiet junior in Kira's AP literature class, had made several attempts to intervene indirectly. He would appear at opportune moments to distract Blake's group or create reasons for Kira to leave situations before they escalated. But David was himself an outsider, the son of Chinese immigrants who had arrived in the neighborhood more recently than Kira's family, and he understood that making himself a visible ally would likely result in both of them becoming targets. Marcus Rivera, one of the few Hispanic students at Jefferson High, had witnessed several of the harassment incidents and felt a kinship with Kira as another visible minority. But Marcus was also a member of the wrestling team, and Blake's influence extended into the athletic department through his friendship with several football players. Marcus had tried to help once, offering to walk with Kira between classes, but Blake had quickly made it clear that this intervention was not welcome. A few strategically placed words about Marcus's immigration status had been enough to make him reconsider his involvement. Even students who sympathized with Kira's situation found themselves powerless to help without risking their own social standing. Sarah Williams, a shy sophomore who sat near Kira in chemistry class, had considered reporting the harassment she witnessed, but her older brother had warned her that Blake's family had enough influence to make life difficult for anyone who crossed them. Sarah contented herself with offering Kira notes when her materials were destroyed and ensuring that she always had a lab partner, small gestures that provided some comfort but didn't address the underlying problem. The isolation was perhaps the most damaging aspect of Kira's ordeal. While Blake's group actively harassed her, the vast majority of her classmates simply pretended she didn't exist. They would step around her when she was picking up scattered books, they would look away when she was being humiliated, and they would fall silent when she approached groups where they had been laughing about her situation. This collective indifference sent a clear message that she was alone in her suffering and that no help would be forthcoming from her peers. Kira's grades began to suffer as the harassment took its toll on her concentration and sleep. Her previously perfect attendance record was marred by days when she simply couldn't face the prospect of 8 hours of systematic humiliation. Her parents noticed the changes but attributed them to the normal stresses of junior year and college preparation. When Kira's mother asked about her obvious distress, Kira would mumble something about challenging coursework and change the subject. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late October, exactly 3 weeks and 2 days after the initial cafeteria incident. The morning had started with unseasonable warmth for autumn, and Kira had allowed herself a rare moment of optimism as she prepared for school. She had saved up money from her part-time job at her uncle's restaurant to buy a new top she'd been eyeing for weeks at the mall. It was a simple but elegant piece in deep blue, a color that complemented her skin tone and made her dark eyes seem even more striking. The top was from a mid-range department store, nothing too expensive or flashy, but it was new and it was hers. More importantly, it represented a small act of defiance against the campaign to make her feel worthless and foreign. If Blake and his crew wanted to attack her appearance and her right to participate in American teenage culture, then wearing something that made her feel confident and attractive was a way of fighting back without throwing a punch. Kira had stood in front of her bedroom mirror that morning, adjusting the top's fit and allowing herself to imagine a day when she walked through Jefferson High's hallways without fear. The blue fabric was soft against her skin, and the cut was flattering without being inappropriate. For the first time in weeks, she looked like any other teenage girl getting ready for school, rather than a victim preparing for battle. She had worn the top to school that day, walking through the parking lot with her head held slightly higher than usual. Several students had noticed her improved appearance, and she had even received a genuine compliment from Amanda Peterson, a girl in her calculus class who had never spoken to her before. For the first 4 periods of the day, Kira had felt something approaching normal teenage confidence. The feeling lasted until she was walking past the trophy case near the gym between 5th and 6th periods. The trophy case was located in a wide hallway that connected the academic wing to the athletic facilities, a space that was always crowded during passing periods. It was also Blake's preferred hunting ground, a location where he could stage his harassment for maximum visibility while maintaining easy escape routes if teachers appeared. Blake and his crew had been waiting near the trophy case, their positioning clearly strategic rather than coincidental. Blake leaned against the glass case, displaying various championships and academic awards, while Tyler sat on a nearby bench with his phone ready, and Jessica stood near the entrance to the girls' bathroom, blocking one of Kira's potential escape routes. The setup was sophisticated enough to suggest planning, as if they had been waiting for the right opportunity to escalate their campaign. "Well, well," Blake said, his voice carrying that particular tone that made Kira's stomach drop and her training instincts go on high alert. "Look what the delivery girl is wearing today. Did you steal that from the lost and found, or did your parents finally save up enough tip money to shop at real stores? Tyler laughed with the practiced timing of someone who had heard this routine before, pulling out his phone as he always did when Blake was about to perform for his audience. Maybe she bought it with money from their restaurant. You know how these people are with money. They'll save every penny just to try to look like they belong here. The casual racism in Tyler's comment was delivered with the kind of smile that made it seem like friendly teasing to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. This was another element of Blake's sophisticated harassment strategy, the ability to make cruel comments sound like harmless jokes, ensuring that any complaint would be dismissed as oversensitivity. Kira tried to walk past them, her internal warning system screaming that this confrontation was different from the others. Blake's posture was more aggressive than usual, and Tyler's camera was positioned too deliberately. Even Jessica seemed more focused, her usual distracted cruelty replaced by predatory attention. Every instinct that her father had trained her to recognize was telling her to avoid this situation, but the hallway offered no alternative routes to her next class. "I'm just trying to get to class," Kira said quietly, her hands instinctively moving to protect her new top. The gesture was unconscious but telling. Even as she tried to de-escalate the situation, part of her mind was already calculating how to minimize damage to the thing that had given her confidence that morning. "Did you hear that?" Jessica chimed in, her voice dripping with false sweetness that was somehow more threatening than Blake's open hostility. "She thinks she's too good to talk to us now. Maybe that new shirt is giving her ideas about her place in this school." Blake straightened up from his casual lean against the trophy case, and Kira could see the subtle shift in his body language that indicated the situation was about to escalate beyond verbal harassment. His shoulders squared, his weight shifted to the balls of his feet, and his hands moved away from his pockets. These were all signs that her father had taught her to recognize as pre-fight indicators, signals that conflict was imminent. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, each detail burned into Kira's memory with painful clarity. Blake reached out and grabbed the fabric of her new top, his fingers twisting in the delicate material with deliberate roughness. The blue fabric bunched in his fist, and Kira could feel the seams beginning to strain under the pressure. "Let's see how good this really is," Blake said, his voice loud enough to attract the attention of nearby students. Several groups had stopped to watch, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Some seemed eager for entertainment, others appeared uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene, and a few had their own phones out to record whatever was about to happen. Then Blake pulled. The sound of tearing fabric echoed through the hallway like a gunshot, sharp and definitive and impossible to ignore. Kira's beautiful new top ripped down the front, the careful seams giving way to reveal her plain white bra underneath. She immediately crossed her arms over her chest and fumbled for her cardigan, her face burning with shame and anger as she tried to cover herself. The small crowd of students who had gathered to watch burst into laughter, but it wasn't the uncomfortable, nervous laughter that sometimes accompanies awkward situations. This was genuine entertainment for them, the kind of cruel amusement that comes from watching someone else's humiliation. Tyler's phone captured every moment of her degradation, the lens focusing on her face as she struggled to maintain composure while covering herself. But it was what Blake said next that truly broke something inside Kira, something that had been bending under the pressure of weeks of harassment, but had somehow remained intact until that moment. "Maybe stick to clothes from your own country next time," Blake said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the hallway to hear. His tone carried a satisfaction that suggested this had been planned, that he had been building toward this moment of public humiliation for weeks. "This American stuff is too good for you anyway. You should shop at whatever weird stores your people use." The racist implications of his comment were impossible to ignore, even for the students who had been treating the situation as entertainment. Several of the onlookers shifted uncomfortably, and one girl actually took a step backward as if distancing herself from Blake's words. But no one spoke up, no one challenged him, and no one offered to help Kira as she stood there with her dignity in ruins. Kira bent to pick up the torn pieces of her top, her hands shaking with rage and humiliation. The fabric was beyond repair, the careful seams torn in multiple places. As she stood up, clutching the ruined clothing to her chest, she caught sight of David Chen watching from across the hallway near the water fountains. David was in her AP literature class, a quiet guy with kind eyes who had always been friendly to her. He was one of the few people at Jefferson High who treated her like a human being rather than an inconvenience or a target. She had harbored a secret crush on him for months, admiring his intelligence and his gentle manner. David always had thoughtful contributions to class discussions, and he had helped her once when she was struggling with a particularly difficult passage in their reading assignment. The look of sympathy and anger in David's eyes was somehow worse than all the laughter combined. Here was someone she respected, someone she cared about, witnessing her ultimate humiliation. He started to move toward her, clearly wanting to help, but Blake's crew was already dispersing, their entertainment over. Tyler was already uploading the video to his social media accounts, adding captions that would ensure Kira's humiliation would follow her home and into the digital space where she had previously found refuge. "Show's over, everyone," Blake announced, with the satisfaction of a performer who had delivered exactly what his audience wanted, "unless anyone else wants to play dress-up with clothes they can't afford." Kira clutched her cardigan tighter and ran for the nearest bathroom, David's concerned voice calling her name, echoing behind her. The sound of his voice, kind and worried, somehow made everything worse. She burst through the bathroom door and locked herself in a stall, finally allowing the tears she had been holding back to fall. She sat on the toilet seat fully clothed, holding the pieces of her ruined top and trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't just another incident in Blake's campaign of harassment. This was a deliberate escalation designed to break her completely. The public nature of the humiliation, the racist comments, the sexual undertones of having her clothing torn off, all combined to create a perfect storm of degradation that would be impossible to overcome. Worse still, she knew that Tyler's video was already making its way around the school's social networks. By the end of the day, every student at Jefferson High would have seen her humiliation. The video would be shared and reshared, commented on and mocked until her degradation became a permanent part of the school's digital folklore. That afternoon, Kira sat in her car in the school parking lot, staring at her ruined top and trying to make sense of what had happened. The fabric felt different now, not just torn, but somehow contaminated by the cruelty that had destroyed it. She had carefully folded the pieces and placed them in a plastic bag, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was evidence, perhaps it was a reminder, or perhaps she simply couldn't bring herself to throw away something that had meant so much to her that morning. Her father's words came back to her. "True strength is having the power to destroy your enemies, but choosing a better path." But what if the better path wasn't working? What if quiet dignity was just another word for cowardice? What if her restraint was enabling Blake and his crew to escalate their harassment because they knew she would never fight back? For the first time since the harassment began, Kira allowed herself to imagine what would have happened if she had responded differently. She could have easily broken Blake's wrist when he grabbed her shirt. She could have disabled Tyler before he had a chance to record anything. She could have put Jessica on the ground with a single, well-placed kick. Her training had given her the tools to end the situation decisively, but her father's philosophy had prevented her from using them. She drove home slowly, taking the long route through the suburban streets where she had grown up. The familiar sights, the elementary school where she had first learned to speak English, The park where her father had taught her to ride a bike, the library where she had spent countless hours reading, all seemed different now, tainted by the knowledge that she was returning home as a defeated victim rather than a strong young woman. Her parents were both at work when she arrived home, which was a relief. She wasn't ready to explain what had happened or to see the disappointment in their eyes when they learned that their daughter had been humiliated so publicly. Instead, she went straight to the garage, where her father's old training equipment waited in the corner like faithful friends. The garage had been converted into a makeshift dojo shortly after they moved into the house. Mirrors lined one wall and thick mats covered the concrete floor. A heavy bag hung in the corner, worn smooth by years of use, and a collection of weapons, wooden swords, staffs, and nunchucks, were mounted on the opposite wall. This was where Kira had spent countless hours perfecting her technique and building the strength and flexibility that made her such a formidable martial artist. Kira changed into her training clothes, a simple white dobok that her father had bought for her when she earned her first black belt. The familiar ritual of dressing for training helped to calm her mind and focus her anger into something more productive than rage. She stood in front of the mirror and bowed formally, beginning the meditation that preceded every training session. But when she began to work, her movements were different from the careful, controlled techniques she usually practiced. Each strike was Blake's smug face, each kick was Tyler's cruel laughter, each throw was Jessica's vicious smile. She attacked the heavy bag with a fury that surprised her, driving her fists and feet into the leather with enough force to make the entire apparatus shake on its mounting. The physical exertion felt good, purging some of the helpless anger that had been building for weeks. Sweat poured down her face as she worked through combinations that she hadn't practiced in months, techniques that were designed for actual combat rather than sport or demonstration. Her father had taught her these moves reluctantly, explaining that they were for extreme situations where her life might be in danger. As she trained, Kira began to understand something about herself that she had been avoiding. Her restraint hadn't been noble, it had been cowardly. She had convinced herself that she was following her father's philosophy about choosing the better path, but in reality, she had been afraid. Afraid of the consequences, afraid of making the situation worse, afraid of confirming the stereotypes about violent minorities that she knew people like Blake held. But what were the consequences of her restraint? Blake's harassment had escalated steadily over 3 weeks, culminating in a public humiliation that would follow her for the rest of her high school career. Her grades were suffering, her mental health was deteriorating, and her sense of safety at school had been completely destroyed. Her better path had led to nothing but more suffering. Over the next few days, Kira's routine changed dramatically. She still attended classes, still did her homework, still worked her shifts at Soul Kitchen. But she also spent hours in the garage every evening, pushing her body to remember skills that had grown rusty from disuse. Her father noticed the change, but said nothing, simply nodding approvingly when he saw her practicing forms in the backyard or working on her flexibility routine. Jin-woo recognized something in his daughter's training that reminded him of his own preparation for serious competitions. The intensity was different from recreational practice, more focused and purposeful. He began joining her for some sessions, pushing her harder than he had in years, and introducing techniques that he had previously considered too advanced or too dangerous for a high school student. The bullying continued during this period, but something had shifted in Kira's demeanor that even Blake noticed. Where before she had seemed defeated and resigned, now she seemed to be waiting for something. Her posture was different, straighter, and more alert. Her movements were more controlled and economical. Most importantly, there was a new quality to her silence when they taunted her, as if she was listening to every word and remembering every detail for future reference. Blake and his crew misinterpreted this change as fear taken to an extreme. They believed that their public humiliation of her had broken her spirit so completely that she was now paralyzed with terror. This perceived victory emboldened them to escalate their tactics even further, believing that they had found the perfect victim who would never fight back, no matter how far they pushed. Tyler began following Kira around school with his camera, documenting her movements and posting videos with titles like "Foreign Exchange Student Tries to Fit In" and "When You Don't Belong But Can't Take a Hint." The videos attracted hundreds of views and dozens of cruel comments from students at Jefferson High and other schools in the district. Tyler's followers began recognizing Kira around town and making comments about her videos, extending her humiliation beyond school hours. Jessica escalated her psychological warfare, spreading rumors that Kira's family was in the country illegally and that her father's medical practice was under investigation for insurance fraud. She started a whisper campaign suggesting that Soul Kitchen was being investigated by the health department for serving cat and dog meat, a racist stereotype that caused several customers to cancel reservations. Jessica's rumors were sophisticated enough to sound plausible while being impossible to trace back to their source. Blake became more physically aggressive, accidentally knocking Kira down in crowded hallways and stepping on her hands when she tried to pick up dropped books. He would slam locker doors near her head just as she was opening her own locker, creating loud noises that made her flinch. He began following her to her car after school, making comments about her driving ability and suggesting that she might have accidents if she didn't learn to be more careful. The administration's response to this escalation was predictably inadequate. When Kira's mother called again to express concern about the social media harassment, she was told that the school couldn't control what students did on their personal accounts outside of school hours. When Jinwoo visited the school to discuss his daughter's obvious distress, Principal Martinez suggested that perhaps Kira would be more comfortable at a school with greater diversity and offered to provide transfer paperwork. David Chen had noticed the change in Kira's demeanor too, but unlike Blake's crew, he interpreted it correctly. David had grown up in a family that valued martial arts and self-discipline, and he recognized the signs of someone preparing for conflict. His grandfather had been a practitioner of Wing Chun Kung Fu, and David had learned enough to recognize the controlled intensity that Kira was now displaying. David had started walking the same routes as Kira between classes, not obviously following but making sure he was nearby when Blake's crew was active. When they targeted her, David would appear with strategically timed questions about homework or offers to study together, creating opportunities for Kira to leave situations before they escalated. He never said much about what he was doing, but his steady support gave Kira strength during the hardest moments. Their friendship had been developing slowly and carefully, built on shared experiences in AP literature and mutual respect for each other's intelligence and character. David was one of the few students at Jefferson High who seemed genuinely interested in Kira's thoughts and opinions, rather than treating her as an exotic curiosity or a convenient target. Their conversations about books and ideas had become one of the few bright spots in Kira's increasingly difficult school experience. It was David who inadvertently triggered the final confrontation. On a Friday afternoon in early November, exactly 1 week after the shirt-tearing incident, he had finally worked up the courage to approach Kira at her locker with a question that had been building in his mind for weeks. "Hey," he said, his voice gentle but slightly nervous. "I was wondering if you'd like to go to the movies this weekend. There's this new action film playing at the theater downtown, Shadow Warrior. I thought you might enjoy it, since it has some really good martial arts sequences." Kira felt her heart skip as she processed what David was asking. Despite everything that had happened, despite the harassment and humiliation and constant fear, David was asking her out on a real date. For a moment, the constant stress and anticipation of the next attack faded away, replaced by the giddy excitement that comes with knowing that someone you care about returns your feelings. "I'd like that," she said, allowing herself a genuine smile for the first time in days. "I've been wanting to see that movie since I saw the trailers." "Great," David said, his own smile lighting up his face with relief and happiness. "I'll pick you up at 7 on Saturday. We can grab dinner before the movie if you want." "Perfect," Kira replied. And for the first time in weeks, she felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Maybe Blake's campaign of harassment hadn't destroyed everything. Maybe there were still good things possible in her life. Unfortunately, Jessica Palmer had been listening from around the corner, her predatory instincts having detected an opportunity for new cruelty. Jessica had been watching David's interactions with Kira for several days, recognizing the developing relationship as a potential vulnerability that could be exploited. She had positioned herself near Kira's locker specifically to eavesdrop on their conversation, and David's invitation was exactly the kind of ammunition she needed. By Monday morning, the entire school knew about Kira and David's movie date, but the story had been twisted through Jessica's expert manipulation into something ugly and humiliating. According to the version that spread through the hallways like wildfire, Kira had thrown herself at David desperately, begging him to take her out because she was so desperate for any male attention she could get. Jessica's version included details about Kira offering to pay for everything and promising sexual favors in exchange for the date. The rumors were sophisticated in their cruelty, incorporating just enough plausible details to seem believable while being devastating to Kira's reputation. Jessica had crafted the story to appeal to existing stereotypes about Asian women being submissive and sexually available, ensuring that the rumors would spread quickly and be difficult to refute. Students who barely knew Kira found themselves repeating the story, adding their own embellishments and interpretations. Blake saw an opportunity in the new rumors that went beyond his usual harassment tactics. If he could humiliate Kira in front of David, he could kill two birds with one stone. Blake had never liked David anyway, seeing him as too quiet, too studious, and too different for his taste. David's obvious intelligence and moral character made Blake feel threatened, and the developing relationship between David and Kira provided the perfect excuse to target both of them. Blake spent the weekend planning what he intended to be the final, decisive blow in his campaign against Kira. He wanted to create a confrontation so devastating that she would be forced to transfer schools, eliminating her as a reminder of his own cruelty while sending a message to other potential targets about the consequences of not knowing their place. The confrontation came during lunch on Tuesday, exactly 1 week after David's invitation and 3 days after their successful movie date. Kira was sitting with David at a table near the windows in the cafeteria, actually laughing at something funny he had said about their chemistry teacher's habit of accidentally setting small fires during demonstrations. For a moment, she looked like any other teenager enjoying lunch with someone she cared about, relaxed and genuinely happy. The weekend had been wonderful in ways that Kira hadn't expected. David had picked her up exactly on time, meeting her parents briefly and making a good impression with his polite manners and obvious respect for their daughter. The movie had been excellent, full of beautifully choreographed fight scenes that reminded Kira of her training. More importantly, David had been genuinely interested in her analysis of the martial arts techniques, asking thoughtful questions and listening carefully to her explanations. After the movie, they had gone to a small cafe near the theater and talked for hours about everything from books to music to their plans for college. David had shared his own experiences as the child of immigrants, and Kira had found herself opening up about the challenges of growing up between two cultures. For the first time in her life, she had felt truly understood by someone outside her family. Blake couldn't stand seeing Kira looking happy and normal, especially not with David. The sight of them laughing together represented everything that Blake found threatening about people who didn't fit into his narrow vision of social hierarchy. Here was someone he had spent weeks trying to destroy, sitting in his cafeteria and acting as if she belonged there. "Well, well," Blake announced as he approached their table, Tyler and Jessica flanking him in their usual formation. His voice carried across the nearby tables, causing conversations to stop and heads to turn. "If it isn't the happy couple. How was your little date, David? Did she make you pay for everything? Or does she actually have money from whatever her family does?" David stood up immediately, his jaw tight with anger. He had heard the rumors that Jessica had been spreading, and he was tired of watching his friends being targeted. "Leave us alone, Blake. We're just trying to eat lunch." "Oh, the boyfriend's going to defend her honor," Tyler laughed, his phone already recording, as he had trained himself to do whenever Blake was about to perform. "This should be good. What are you going to do? Bore him to death with homework help?" Blake turned his attention to Kira, who had gone very still in her chair. She was watching him with the kind of focused attention that her father had taught her to give to serious opponents, cataloging his movements and preparing for multiple scenarios. Blake mistook her stillness for fear and smiled with satisfaction. "You know, I've been thinking about what happened last week with your little fashion show," Blake said, referring to the shirt-tearing incident with casual cruelty. "Maybe David can buy you some new clothes since you clearly can't manage it yourself. Of course, he'd have to get a job first, and I'm not sure anyone's hiring." "That's enough," David said, stepping between Blake and Kira. His voice was quiet but firm, and there was something in his posture that suggested he was more prepared for confrontation than his studious appearance might suggest. "Is it?" Blake pushed David aside with casual strength, his hands making contact with David's chest hard enough to send him stumbling backward. "Because I think your girlfriend needs to learn her place in this school. And her place is at the bottom, where she belongs, with all the other immigrants who don't know when they're not wanted." Before Kira could react, Blake grabbed her lunch tray and dumped it over her head. Cold tomato soup and pieces of sandwich dripped down her face and onto her clothes, covering her in food debris while the cafeteria erupted in laughter and gasps. Tyler's phone captured every moment of the humiliation, the lens focusing on her shocked expression as she sat there covered in lunch remnants. But Blake wasn't done. As Kira sat there, food dripping from her hair and face, he leaned down and whispered just loud enough for David and several nearby students to hear, "You could do so much better than this foreign trash, David. What would your parents think if they knew you were slumming it with someone like her? Maybe you should find a real American girl, instead of playing charity case with the help." That was when something snapped inside Kira. Not the public humiliation, not the ruined clothes, not even the cruel racist words. It was the way Blake was trying to poison her relationship with David, the one good thing she had found in this nightmare of a school. Blake was trying to take away the first person who had seen her as something more than a victim or a target, and that was unforgivable. Kira stood up slowly, soup still dripping from her hair and face. Her movements were controlled and deliberate, each motion economical and purposeful. The laughter in the cafeteria began to die down as students sensed something different in her posture, something that suggested the familiar victim was gone and someone else had taken her place. "You know what, Blake?" Kira said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room. Her tone was conversational, almost friendly, but there was something underneath it that made nearby students take a step backward. Blake smiled, thinking he had finally broken her completely. "Done with what? Pretending you belong here? Ready to transfer to a school where they appreciate your kind?" "Done with you," Kira replied, and the way she said it made Blake's smile falter for the first time in weeks. The three words carried a finality that seemed to change the very atmosphere of the cafeteria. Students who had been laughing moments before now watched in silence, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Even Tyler lowered his phone slightly, caught off guard by the sudden shift in dynamic. "What did you just say to me?" Blake demanded, his voice rising as he tried to reassert control over the situation. "I said I'm done with you." Kira repeated, wiping soup from her face with deliberate calm. I'm done with your pathetic need to hurt people to feel important. I'm done with your racist comments that you think make you clever. And I'm done pretending that you're anything more than a sad, insecure boy who peaked in high school and will spend the rest of his life trying to recapture the only time he ever felt powerful. The cafeteria was dead silent now. Hundreds of students watching the confrontation with the kind of fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. Blake's face had gone red, his hands clenched into fists, and his breathing had become audibly harsh. For someone who had built his reputation on being able to intimidate and control others, being called out so directly and publicly was a devastating blow to his authority. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Blake snarled, advancing on Kira with obvious intent to physical violence. "You think you're tough now? Let me show you what happens to people who don't know their place." "I don't think I'm tough," Kira said, her voice steady and calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I know I am." Blake lunged forward, his fist aimed at Kira's face in a wild haymaker that telegraphed his intent from across the room. What happened next would be talked about at Jefferson High for years to come, analyzed and reanalyzed until it became the stuff of legend. Kira moved like water, flowing around Blake's clumsy punch with the grace of someone who had spent years perfecting her craft. Her left hand caught his wrist as it passed, redirecting his momentum, while her right elbow drove upward into his solar plexus with surgical precision. The impact drove the air from his lungs, leaving him gasping and doubled over in pain. But Kira wasn't finished. As Blake stumbled backward, trying to catch his breath, she spun with the fluid motion of a dancer and drove her knee into his stomach. The blow lifted him slightly off his feet and sent him staggering toward the nearest table. Before he could recover, Kira followed with a perfect roundhouse kick that connected with his ribs and sent him sprawling across the floor. The whole sequence took less than 5 seconds, but every movement was visible to the hundreds of students who watched in amazement. This wasn't the wild flailing of an amateur fight. This was the controlled application of technique by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Tyler dropped his phone, his mouth hanging open in shock. He had been filming fights for years, but he had never seen anyone move with the kind of controlled precision that Kira had just displayed. Jessica stumbled backward, her face pale with shock as she realized that their carefully planned humiliation had gone horribly wrong. Around the cafeteria, students were on their feet, some cheering, others simply staring in amazement. The quiet girl who had been their designated victim had just dismantled the school's biggest bully with techniques that looked like something out of a movie. Several students were already filming with their own phones, ensuring that this confrontation would be documented from multiple angles. Blake struggled to his feet, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. The easy confidence that had defined his interactions with others was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that he had badly underestimated his opponent. He was breathing heavily, clutching his ribs where Kira's kick had connected, and his expensive clothes were dirty from the floor. "You little..." Blake started to say, but Kira cut him off with a gesture that somehow managed to be both dismissive and threatening. "I'm not done," she said, her voice carrying a new authority that made even the watching teachers hesitate to intervene. "You wanted to fight. Let's fight." Blake charged again, this time trying to tackle her around the waist. Kira sidestepped with minimal effort and used his momentum against him, throwing him over her hip in a perfect judo throw. Blake hit the floor hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him again and leaving him sprawled on his back like a turtle. Tyler, seeing his leader getting dominated by someone he had spent weeks helping to torment, decided to jump in. He rushed at Kira from behind, but she had been trained to fight multiple opponents from the time she was 12 years old. She heard his footsteps, spun to face him, and caught his arm as he tried to grab her. The arm lock that followed was textbook perfect, twisting Tyler's limb behind his back while sweeping his legs out from under him. He hit the floor face first, his arm pinned painfully behind him in a position that would cause serious injury if he tried to struggle. "Stay down," Kira told him, her voice cold as winter ice. Tyler nodded frantically, tears of pain in his eyes as he felt the pressure on his shoulder joint. Blake had managed to get to his feet again, but he was moving more cautiously now. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that he was badly outmatched. He swung wildly, but Kira ducked under his punch and drove her fist into his ribs with enough force to make him scream. The crack of bone was audible across the cafeteria, followed immediately by Blake's cry of pain as he stumbled backward, clutching his side. Several students gasped, realizing that this had moved beyond a simple fight into something more serious. Blake's pride wouldn't let him quit, even though he was clearly defeated. He pulled out his phone as if to call for help, but Kira was already moving. She leaped forward, her foot connecting with his chest in a perfect flying kick that sent him crashing into the wall behind him. Blake slid down the wall and stayed there, gasping and defeated. His expensive clothes were torn and dirty, his perfectly styled hair was a mess, and his face showed the kind of fear that comes from realizing you've pushed the wrong person too far. For a moment, Kira stood over him, her fist raised for the finishing blow that would put him down permanently. The entire cafeteria held its breath, waiting to see if she would cross the line from defender to aggressor. But then, Kira remembered her father's words about true strength, and she slowly lowered her fist. She had proven her point without becoming the kind of person that Blake was. She had defended herself and shown everyone in the school that she was not a victim, but she had stopped short of unnecessary cruelty. "Stay away from me," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent cafeteria. "Stay away from David. Stay away from anyone who can't defend themselves, because if you don't, I promise you this was just a warm-up." Blake nodded weakly, unable to speak through his pain and humiliation. Around the cafeteria, students were applauding, but this wasn't the cruel laughter that had followed Kira's previous humiliations. This was genuine respect, admiration for someone who had stood up to a bully and won. David appeared at her side, his face full of awe and concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle despite the adrenaline of what he had just witnessed. "I'm fine," Kira said, and for the first time in weeks, she meant it completely. "Actually, I'm better than fine." The aftermath was swift and decisive. Principal Martinez finally showed up, alerted by teachers who had been too shocked to intervene during the actual fight. He tried to suspend all parties involved, but the dozens of witnesses and Tyler's own recording made it clear who the aggressors had been. Blake received a 2-week suspension and was permanently removed from the football team. Tyler and Jessica got week-long suspensions and were banned from all school events for the remainder of the semester. Kira received a single day of in-school suspension, but it was clearly a token punishment designed to maintain the appearance of zero tolerance for violence. Principal Martinez had privately told her that while the school couldn't officially condone fighting, he understood that she had been defending herself against a pattern of harassment that the administration had failed to address. The change in the school's social dynamics was immediate and profound. Students who had ignored Kira's suffering for weeks now approached her with apologies and expressions of respect. The hallways that had once felt like a gauntlet became simply pathways to class. Teachers who had looked the other way during her harassment now nodded approvingly when they saw her, and several mentioned that they had always known she had hidden strength. Blake returned to school 2 weeks later, his swagger completely gone. He walked with his head down, his broken rib still healing and his reputation in ruins. The video of his defeat had spread far beyond Jefferson High, making him a laughingstock on social media. He never bothered Kira again, and when their paths crossed in the hallway, he would actually step aside to let her pass. Tyler's social media accounts were suspended after he was caught posting harassment content, and his phone was confiscated by his parents when they learned about his role in the bullying campaign. Without his digital platform, Tyler found himself isolated and ignored by the classmates who had once enjoyed his cruel content. Jessica's reputation for vicious gossip was permanently damaged when several of her previous victims came forward with their own stories, emboldened by Kira's example. Her influence over the school's social hierarchy crumbled as students realized that her power came only from their willingness to participate in her cruelty. On the Friday after the confrontation, Kira sat in her car in the school parking lot. But this time she wasn't hiding or recovering from humiliation. She was waiting for David, who had asked her to the school's winter formal. As she watched students stream out of the building, she reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. She had learned that sometimes the better path wasn't about avoiding conflict, but about standing up for what was right when all other options had been exhausted. She had discovered that her father's lessons about strength and discipline hadn't been about weakness, but about choosing the right moment to act with maximum effect. Most importantly, she had learned that respect wasn't something that could be demanded or taken, but something that had to be earned through courage and character. David appeared at her window, his smile bright and genuine. The admiration in his eyes wasn't just for her fighting ability, but for the courage she had shown in finally standing up for herself and others. "Ready to go?" he asked. "Ready," Kira replied, and as they drove away from Jefferson High, she felt truly free for the first time in months. She had found her strength not in violence for its own sake, but in the courage to protect herself and those she cared about when peaceful solutions were no longer possible. The quiet girl who had once been an easy target had become someone who would never be a victim again, and more importantly, someone who would never allow others to be victimized in her presence. The story of Kira Voss and her flying elbow would become legend at Jefferson High, but more importantly, it would serve as a reminder that true strength comes not from the ability to hurt others, but from the courage to protect yourself and those you care about when all other options have been exhausted. In a world where bullies counted on the silence and compliance of their victims, Kira had chosen to speak with actions, and in doing so, she had changed not just her own life, but the entire culture of her school.